members of council and guests. First, I'd like to say thank you for your time this afternoon. This afternoon's work session is dedicated to the topic of housing. Historically, housing programs and policy have been largely the domain of federal and state governments. Increasingly, however, local elected bodies and their communities are confronted by challenges associated with affordable housing, workforce housing, housing insecurity, and homelessness. Some small and medium-sized cities are even hiring staff and dedicated to housing and making capital investments in housing-related projects. There are likely a half a dozen to a dozen subtopics for housing, each worthy of examination and discussion. This afternoon, however, our presenters are focused on housing policy generally and the local and regional housing market. These presentations are intended to provide, or at least begin to provide, an informational foundation on which the City Council can consider its work as it relates to housing. You will not hear specific recommendations this afternoon. We are simply taking the beginning steps to understanding housing and the programs and policies that can influence it, especially at the local level. Our first presenter is Jonathan Knopp. He is the Executive Director for Programs at Housing Forward Virginia. In that role, he directs the agency's research, programs, and efforts across the Commonwealth. This work includes regional and local housing needs assessments, policy generation and implementation, and communication strategies. He specializes in telling stories about Virginia's housing challenges through data and regularly presents at conferences and events throughout the state. Jonathan has a master's in urban and regional planning from Virginia Commonwealth University, where he also teaches an introductory urban planning course. I chose Jonathan, or invited Jonathan, and I'm grateful that he accepted the invitation because he furnished one of the most succinct yet comprehensive overviews of housing policy at the recent Valley Housing Summit, or SAW Housing Summit. Jonathan's agency, Housing Forward Virginia, seeks to positively impact housing by, among other efforts, informing public policy and housing regulations, supporting local and regional housing networks, encouraging a healthy lending and financial environment, convening key stakeholders, and providing leaders with actionable information. After Jonathan's presentation, Leslie Tate, our Director of Community Development, will present some preliminary results from the Regional Housing Study commissioned by the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission. City Council is not asked to provide any guidance or feedback this evening, though I do hope that the presentations will prompt questions and some discussion. The objective for the meeting is first to inform the Council about the complexity of housing and housing policy. Secondly, identify opportunities for local elected bodies to influence housing in their communities. And finally, connect the relevance of housing to community health and prosperity. I would expect that as the housing study is completed and finalized by the planning district, that would prompt another opportunity for us to reflect on this information and consider policy options as we work forward. So with that, I'll invite Jonathan to the podium.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. So, Leslie, please count down 30 minutes and get the shepherd's hook ready. We'll see how much we can get through in 30 minutes. As Mr. Hamp alluded to, this is a pretty tall task. And I think one theme of what you'll hear me talk about over the next half hour or so is that housing is pretty complicated, at least housing policy and its interactions from the federal, state, and local levels. And we have a lot of housing problems in our country and in our state right now. Some things are working, some things aren't really working. And it's going to take a lot to unravel those and find the right solutions to fix those problems that we have. So I'm happy to answer any kind of quick questions or things that you would like me to clarify throughout. Please feel free to interrupt me. But I think we agree that any kind of more substantive questions about, that may require a longer answer, we may just wait until my presentation is done and Leslie's, and then we can have a really good conversation after that. And I'm happy to stay for as long as you all may need me. So why is it so hard to talk about housing? Why is it such a challenge for me to put together some slides to explain how housing works and how housing policy is all put together in just half an hour? Well, there's clearly way too much going on. There's too much policy. There's mortgages. There's zoning. There's landlord-tenant law. There are so many things in different rabbit holes that we could go down and spend the entire night talking about. Another interesting thing is that many people struggle to imagine a reality other than their own. Housing is unique in that we all need a home. We all live in a home if we're lucky enough to live in our own home. And that's where we spend most of our time. And unless you go to school for planning or real estate or you're in that industry, you don't spend tons of time thinking about the whole system. And so when you're confronted with data and circumstances about how other folks are struggling or the successes that other people may have that you are not having in the housing market, it's really tough to reconcile those things, and that's, I think, very natural for humans to feel that way. Unfortunately, though, a lot of our historic policy decisions and actions in America around housing have a sordid history based in racism and classism and attempts to segregate us from one another. And unfortunately, some of those feelings do still persist today. And sometimes conversations about housing and new housing and who should live where can be tainted by these things. And so conversations aren't always as productive as you may want them to be. And so because of all of this, it's very easy to get frustrated and talk past one another when you actually may agree on more things than you think. Just housing is so personal and so complex that it's tough to have a good conversation about. And I'm not going to fix that today, but hopefully I can set the seeds for it. So what can we do about this? First is we need to know our facts and our history. There's lots of them. So again, I'm not going to cover all of them in the entire history of how we got to here today. But I want to mention a few things that I think are important and helpful context. One other theme, I think, of what I'll talk about, and a theme of the regional study that we'll talk a little bit more about, is focusing on solutions. There have been lots of studies, lots of reports, lots of data. There's no shortage of data out there in the housing world, and a lot of it points to some significant problems that we have. Folks spending way too much of their disposable income on their rent or their mortgage and property taxes and everything that goes into it, utilities also. We have folks that my generation, younger generations that are really having a hard time breaking into home ownership because of lack of supply, and now the interest rates have gone up. And so we know we have these problems, and I think we are kind of at the tipping point, at least in Virginia and in a lot of the communities that I talk to across the state. The people are ready to talk about something to do, right? Let's not talk about how bad things are, but let's figure out what we can actually do about it. And I think in doing so, we also need to spend a little bit of time rethinking how we actually talk about housing and the way that we frame our conversations. And so I want to cover that a little bit briefly, because the way that we've talked about housing and the terms that we've used over the past generation don't really seem to work the way that we want them to. So in about, I guess, probably 25 minutes now, I'll try to explain what affordable housing is and why I'm putting those in quotes. What I'm going to call the 3 S's of success, but I've cribbed from another author, but I think they're very relevant and helpful here. And then again, reframing the picture of housing and maybe thinking about housing from a different perspective that allows you to have more productive conversations about it, either here in this setting, with your neighbor, at your church, wherever, because housing is so tricky to talk about. And then I will kind of introduce some of the broader context around this regional study, but then let Leslie talk about more specifics and some of the data that's been put together so far. So about us, Housing Forward is a statewide nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. Our board includes state agencies, representatives from almost every element of the housing sector that we can find in Virginia, and we try to keep ourselves diverse also in geographic representation, all the way from far southwest to Hampton Roads, up to Northern Virginia and everywhere in between. And so We do lots of data, lots of talking like this, and have spent a lot of time recently outside of the urban crescent, which I really enjoy, to be in communities outside of the 95 Eastern 64 corridor, because there are some exciting things and interesting things happening outside of that bubble. And I think often more progress and more willingness to try new things around housing, even though a lot of the problems and challenges are very similar across the state, just to different degrees. And I think one important thing about us is that we are not an advocacy organization. We do not lobby the General Assembly. We do not lobby local elected officials. We don't lobby Congress. We are entirely focused on trying to help practitioners like you all in the public sector and the private sector, nonprofit, figure out what your problems are, what are your priorities, and how can we help you based on what we're able to do, get to the place that you want to be. So I think that sets us apart a little bit, and I hope contributes to our success. So question number one, what is affordable housing? It's one single term that gets thrown around a lot, but it's got many different definitions. I think as policymakers or people working in City Hall or administering housing programs, you often come at it from this technical perspective. So your home is affordable if you pay no more than 30% of your gross income on housing cost. If you do pay more than that, you are what we generally call cost burdened, housing cost burdened. If you pay more than 50%, you are severely cost burdened or extremely cost burdened. And that's just a very rough, gross way of understanding to what extent is somebody's housing costs putting a burden on their ability to thrive and succeed, pay for food, pay for childcare, pay for transportation, save, pay off debt, all those things. If you are paying that much for your home, your budget is probably not in the place that it really should be in order for you to succeed. Programmatically, sometimes a lot of people say affordable housing and they mean specifically housing, whether it is rental housing or a home that has been purchased by somebody, where some sort of public program or public subsidy, some kind of tax dollars from the federal, state, or local levels has been used to artificially lower the price of that home to meet the ability of a person at a moderate to lower income to afford that rent or to buy that home. So that's a policy definition. And then finally, I think in conversations in the community and with just members of the public generally, affordable housing is a much broader term and encompasses things like how safe you feel, how secure, how healthy your home is. Do you have mold in your home? Are you spending way too much on your utilities because you have super old windows that are leaking during the winter? Your rent may be super cheap, but you are spending just as much of that to keep your house warm. And so are you really living in an affordable home at that point? So I think affordable housing can encompass all of these. None of these are wrong, but it's very much context dependent on what you're actually trying to talk about and what specific type of housing or condition of housing that you want to refer to. And so I think a better way to think about housing and to kind of start this conversation is that housing is on a spectrum of incomes, right, and ability for households and persons to pay for their homes. And so we can take what we call area median income, which HUD uses to set program limits for different affordable housing programs and housing assistance. They take data that's collected annually from the census, and they say, okay, roughly this is our best estimate for the median income in a given area, and we have some formulas to calculate, what the 80, 50, 30% of those incomes are, broken down by the number of persons in a household, and we can then define those as low income, very low income, or extremely low income. And so generally, we would want to target housing assistance that is, serving people in much more precarious positions down to that 30% level. At the 80% low income level, those folks may not have too much trouble finding a home they can afford on the market that isn't subsidized, but if the rental market is going a little crazy, then they are going to be cost burdened and have some issues. But it's very dependent on what the different regional market dynamics are. And so, again, this is not a perfect way, but it is, from a policy-making perspective, it's what we got. So we have to deal with it for now. And so if we use that AMI as kind of our x-axis to think about how this spectrum is lined up, on the left, we're starting with people with the least amount of income, zero income, lowest ability to pay for housing, all the way to folks around, average incomes to a little bit above, who generally are not going to have any issue paying for homes on the market. And so things that we create to serve that lower end of the spectrum are shelters for persons experiencing homelessness, transitional housing to try to get folks who are in homelessness out and into a permanent home, very deep rental assistance, which is pretty much entirely, as you'll see in a second, the purview of the federal government. And so we have a lot of public assistance, relatively speaking, dedicated to trying to find better housing solutions for these hard-to-house people. But for folks that do have low but very fixed incomes who are at this level and do have a home of some kind, more often than not, they are living in a market-based home. There is no subsidy attached to it. They are just spending way too much of their income on it and maybe making sacrifices because that home is cheap for a reason, because it's in poor quality, in a very bad neighborhood, etc. So lots of different dynamics going on there. Moving up the spectrum to folks around 50 to 80% median income, this is generally where the bulk of new dedicated affordable housing units that are created serves. And this is where most of the kind of lower cost market affordable homes serve households. And so to some extent, newer market rate rentals can serve, folks up to 80%, 100%, but it's going to be a little tough, and again, depends on kind of what the market dynamics are. But this is where a lot of our federal programs are oriented, particularly the low-income housing tax credit, which I'll mention a little bit more about in a second. And then finally, we get into incomes that are able to purchase a home, or more able to purchase a home. And so this is where the for sale market comes into play, both resales and new builds for folks that are usually higher income because newer homes are more expensive. But we have lots of affordable homeownership programs like Habitat for Humanity, other down payment grants that can help folks around 70, 80% AMI afford a home of their own to purchase. So there's lots of different things going in here, but I think thinking about the spectrum is hopefully a helpful way to make a little bit more sense of how all these different programs and housing solutions are organized. So some of those programs, how do they work? So let's begin at the end of that spectrum, the homelessness and supportive housing. Lots of federal and state grants and a lot of philanthropy also at the local and regional levels. Those federal grants flow through our state housing agencies, most notably DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, or sometimes directly to local governments, which can then go to continuums of care, or COCs, or local planning groups. These are the kind of regional coordinating entities, agencies that do the homelessness work and efforts to end homelessness in a particular area. And so this money flows to shelters, permanent supportive housing, other service providers, housing counseling, everything to kind of help folks who are hard to house for all sorts of reasons. That deep rental assistance, that is pretty much entirely funding from the federal government, from HUD. We have public housing. Waynesboro does have some public housing. You have a public housing authority. That money comes from HUD's budget and goes directly to public housing authorities. The other big source of federal money for deep rental assistance is household-based. It's housing choice vouchers. What is still Section 8, but Section 8 is generally, most people refer to it. Section 8 housing does not exist anymore. That is not a program that is on the books. We do not create new Section 8 housing. What the federal government has done is transferred those to vouchers and give households the ability to take their rental assistance onto the private market. And so those vouchers, in where there is a public housing authority, will come straight from HUD. In other parts of Virginia that do not have a public housing authority, they go to our State Housing Finance Agency, VHDA, Virginia Housing, and then to local voucher administrator organizations. So lots of different things flowing together there. And then on the dedicated affordable rental, so units that aren't really serving that, super deep, extremely low income level, but folks around half of the median income that still would struggle to find an affordable rental on the open market. That is where the low-income housing tax credit program comes into play. This is not a subsidy per se. This is a tax credit that comes from the IRS. It is set by the federal government each year. The amount of that tax credit, states are allocated through a formula, a certain amount of that tax credit that then goes to VHDA. VHDA takes applications from developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, to build low-income housing tax credit projects. And then VHDA will make awards, offer those tax credits to those projects. The tax credits are then syndicated and flow out to entities, whether it's banks, financial institutions, other investors that have some sort of tax liability and can benefit from that tax credit. So it's a pretty circuitous route and kind of a Rube Goldberg machine to get there, but this is the predominant way that America produces new dedicated affordable housing in our communities. But there are also other state funds, public funds, philanthropy in some cases, that go through DHCD and elsewhere that support the development of new affordable rental housing. But the main thing to remember is that it's LIHTC is the engine that's driving it. And so how do we kind of get to this position in the first place? In my original presentation, I had 3 charts, but I realized I actually need 7. So I apologize in advance. I gave you fair warning, but I'll go through these somewhat quickly. It's all about supply and demand. That's what it comes down to at the end of the day. Econ 101, there's lots of different things that get us to here, but at the end of the day, we do not have enough homes for the demand that is out there. In fact, we stopped building homes when we needed to the most. About 10, 15 years ago, when the Great Recession hit, housing market crashed, housing production tanked, and that just happened to be when my generation was going into college and coming out of college and needed new homes, apartments to get into, and eventually starter homes to buy. And it was the same time that the boomer generation saw those millennials leave their homes and go to college, and all of a sudden they're left with a 4-bedroom home in the suburbs that maybe is too much for them now, and they want to downsize also, maybe move to a different community. And so there's a bunch of demand for housing because of our demographics. And it was the exact same time that we stopped building housing in America, and we are still treading water and playing catch up today. And so the big thing that also has been the kind of bubbling cauldron all this time for the past almost 100 years is that local governments regulate where and how much housing gets built. And unfortunately, local governments have decided over the past few generations to only allow single-family housing, detached single-family housing, which is the most expensive type of housing to build, in the vast majority of their community. And so when that is the only type of housing that you allow people to build and you regulate even further in terms of the design and where things can go and other things that pile on, housing becomes very expensive to build. And if you compare the actual hard construction cost since 1980 to what prices have done since then, you can see that it's not really the inputs, the materials and labor that are making homes more expensive. It is everything else that gets added on to the top of it. It is the regulatory regime that we impose that makes new housing much harder to build. And so this is housing production in Virginia, broken down by single-family homes on the left. Over on the right, larger multifamily units, so things that are in buildings with 5 or more homes contained in the same building, so apartment buildings. And then notice how there's nothing in between. This is what we call the missing middle. So 2, 3, 4 unit smaller apartment buildings, duplexes. We just stopped building those about 100 years ago, or about maybe 80 years ago or so, certainly after World War II. And zoning was a large reason for that. And America has kind of forgotten how to build them because developers don't do that. There's no product for it. But there's a big demand for it. And I think a lot of communities are trying to find ways to incentivize this type of housing to be built. And so one problem that we're dealing with in Virginia is that we are hundreds of thousands of units short of what we actually need to make housing affordable to everybody in the state. And so obviously much of that demand is in the urban crescent. We have Northern Virginia to blame for a lot of it, as we have to blame for them for a lot of things, but we still have tens of thousands of affordable units that we need everywhere else across the state. So the problem is everywhere. It's at different scales, looks a little different, but we do not have enough homes. And when we don't have enough homes, the folks with the least ability to pay have the hardest time and suffer the most. And so I was alluding to kind of the changing environment at the federal level over the past few generations, and I don't need to walk through every part of this chart, but basically what this chart shows is that public housing, down here in the yellow, public housing funding has remained constant, kind of gone down a little bit relative to GDP, and the vast majority of federal assistance is going into housing choice vouchers, not the construction of new units. And so what has the federal government done? The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. It produces more than 50,000 new homes annually. This is nationwide. It's thousands of homes in Virginia each year. It's very productive, but it is not the most efficient system out there. But this is what we have. And so the situation we have today is that only a small fraction of eligible lower-income households who have a housing problem actually receive housing assistance of any kind. The demand is far much higher than what our public assistance and our programs can actually offer. So where does this leave us? Accelerating prices just reflect the lack of supply that we have. Supply and demand. These shifts in federal housing policy have placed additional burden and responsibility on you all and our state governments to try to figure out this problem. And so it's tough to even think about the future and plan for the future when we're still trying to solve these problems that have been brewing for decades. So, that was a bunch of bad news. How can we fix it? I think the best summation that I have seen are these three S's. Number one, supply, which we talked about, stability, and subsidy. So those are the three different policy areas or things that you can think about that can actually have some sort of effect on housing outcomes and housing markets. So on the supply side, trying to create an abundance of homes for everybody. Obviously, housing production is significantly impacted and influenced by a lot of things that you all have absolutely zero control over. So I think that's very important for your constituents and for the public to understand is that you do not have the lever to make anything happen. Just like you don't have the lever to change gas prices or to change interest rates. You cannot control everything because housing is regional, housing is a national industry. So there's lots of other inputs that go into this. But as local governments, what you can do and what you have the unique power to do is determine where and what type of housing you want to see, because you have the unique authority to regulate your land uses and to implement zoning ordinances. And so you can use your long-term planning ability to explore, what type of housing is actually needed to meet your current needs and your projected needs. Make sure that your land use goals actually reflect the housing issues that you have today. You can think about expanding accessory dwelling units in residential districts. Allow property owners to build a separate small unit that they can rent out or have a caretaker live in. We should give property owners that right in a lot of cases. That can do a lot of good. We need to allow multifamily not giant apartment buildings all the time, but that missing middle that we were talking about, that we used to build when we were, building small towns and rural areas, and that still kind of reflect in the charming Main Street towns that we see today. We're just not building that, and so all those buildings are, in rougher shape if they're not invested in. And so why don't we build more of those? Because everybody seems to like them. That seems to be what is featured in all of like the Hallmark Christmas movies, and that's how Disneyland is set up. It's the small scale, apartments and smaller homes and shops all kind of mixed in together. People pay a lot of good money to visit a place like that if they don't live in one. And so, in addition to the land use and zoning pieces, you can also create development incentives, through utility hookups, through, your other types of permitting. There's a huge, vast array of different things that you can do. But really, at the end of the day, what seems to be the focus and seems to be the main thing that can unlock the market to actually serve the demand that's out there is your land use controls. On the stability side, local governments have even less powers here, because so much of what we think about in terms of residential stability, keeping homeowners in place and preventing them from going into foreclosure if they lose their job, keeping renters in place if they lose their job also, or for whatever reason, and so they're facing eviction, or their home's in really rough shape, and they really have nowhere else to move to, and so they're suffering as a result. All of that is really kind of defined by state law, and private contracts between two people or a person and a lending institution. So, what can you do? You can try to orient your zoning and any kind of financial resources that you are making available to make permanent supportive housing easier. So really try to make homelessness functionally obsolete, so that anybody who goes into a shelter can get into some sort of permanent housing situation very quickly and get stabilized. You can also make sure that any funding you do have or do create is really committed to preserving your existing stock that is owner occupied and renter occupied. Make homes energy efficient. Make them accessible to persons with disabilities and seniors. Just make your existing homes better suited for folks that need to live there. Manufactured homes is a whole different topic that we can get into, but that is some of the worst housing stock that we have in Virginia today, but fills an incredibly important need in terms of satisfying demand for affordable housing, for better or for worse. And so we don't really know what to do with manufactured housing. We're trying to figure it out over the past few years as local governments and the state and nonprofit groups and housing practitioners have started to look into ways to think about what manufactured housing should be in the 21st century. And then I know there's been some discussion of rental inspection programs here in the city. This is something that the state does enable cities to do in Virginia with some pretty significant limitations, setting up a rental inspection district by an ordinance, and then allowing city inspectors to go in and look for different health and safety aspects of rental homes. To my knowledge, there is not really a prolific or successful example of a rental inspection program in Virginia, certainly within any cities that are comparable in size and market to Waynesboro. So I wish I had examples of either super successful ones or really bad ones that we can learn from to show, but you would have to experiment if you did decide to pursue one. But I think an important thing to remember is that a rental inspection program, while could have very significant outcomes in terms of getting landlords to improve the stock that they have, there's two important caveats. Number one, it requires public capacity, the staff to do that. You need to make an investment to do it, and existing capacity of inspectors in City Hall, anywhere, it's not just a Waynesboro problem, is very limited to have a successful rental inspection program. I think the other super important thing is that this is really only trying to fix the problem at the very tail end. Poor housing conditions and landlords that are unwilling to make improvements and upgrades in their homes to make them more habitable reflect very limited supply, because landlords have no incentive to make any investments if they know that if that tenant leaves, there's going to be somebody knocking on the door 30 seconds later because they need a home. So I think we need to figure out ways to solve the supply problem and the supply and demand dynamics in the first place before trying to find these other Band-Aid solutions. So you can tell it's complex. And then finally, subsidy. Again, not tons that you can do here because this is, federal and state governments have a lot more money than you do. And traditionally, local governments in Virginia have not been funding housing activities of their own. It's really only something that happens in Northern Virginia or larger cities that just have a higher tax rate and a higher tax base. But you can coordinate regionally. There is now a New River Valley Regional Housing Trust Fund just down 81. So we are seeing some smaller localities pull together and find ways to bring in new money that can be used in their communities. If you do have any dedicated revenue and spending for housing, I think generally you want to target that for things that don't require a lot of capital. So, don't try to fund the construction of new housing because that's super expensive and that's where the federal and state governments can come in. But you can fund, operations and services and things that really help on the edges, housing counseling, things like that, where you're just kind of covering one staff position at an agency or a nonprofit. That is a much lighter lift that can have pretty serious impacts and benefits to a lot of people than it is trying to create a revolving loan fund for new affordable housing. So finally, I'll kind of end before talking about the regional study on messaging and framing housing conversations. So again, it's not easy to talk about housing. I think I've said this about 10 times so far tonight. Because housing is personal. Everybody should have a home, needs a home, and a lot of times, more often than not, people don't think about housing in the general housing policy realm and the housing market. They don't think about it beyond their own front door and beyond their own individual experiences and transactions that they have. Something I think that's also very unique is that housing really isn't partisan at the local and state level as much as a lot of other issues, just about everything else today. It is one of the few issues where bipartisanship, at least from my perspective, still is very common, and where a common ground can be found between folks of all sorts of different ideologies. But it still breaks people's brains a lot of the time, including my own. And so here's an example of something that we find, in cities in Virginia. So Arlington County, way up in Northern Virginia, over the past couple of years, wanted to change their zoning to allow missing middle housing, so those smaller duplexes, 3-4 unit apartment buildings in most, if not all, of their single-family neighborhoods, and let the market decide where that should go, if that should be developed. And there was a lot of pushback, a lot of advocacy on the pro side, a lot of housing advocates. But we saw some interesting lines of thought here, and so I grabbed this from Twitter or whatever it's called now, a little over a year ago. And you see this sign in the person's yard, and this is a pretty common sign in a lot of more progressive parts of Virginia. And you want to kind of expect this person or the folks in this household to, espouse being welcome and opening their arms and receiving people of all different backgrounds and types and income levels. But just a few feet away on the other side of their sidewalk, they said, well, no, we can welcome people, but as long as you don't live near me. I want my neighborhood to stay exactly the way it was when I moved in, and I want to have veto power over that. And so it's just the ways that you would normally think about housing issues through our traditional partisan lens don't always work out. And so I think another dynamic at play here is that because housing is something that everybody experiences in some way, but again, not everybody is a housing expert, people like to think that they are experts because they've dealt with housing their whole life. And so we have the Dunning-Kruger effect kick in, which is this little piece of pop psychology that I think is kind of based in literature, but it seems to make sense for me, at least on the housing issue, where when you don't really know much, you think you know everything. I've certainly been guilty of that before. But as soon as you learn a little bit more, you realize that you actually know nothing. And you are not an expert, and things are super complicated, and you're never going to understand it. But eventually, as you get more experience and you learn more and talk to more people, you kind of reach what they call the plateau of sustainability. So I think this happens a lot in community meetings and conversations because people are rightfully very emotional about housing and their neighborhoods, but they don't always understand kind of what has led them to the place of a new apartment building getting proposed and having to go through a rezoning. So it's a very tough dynamic to be put in. And so when we think about talking about housing, a lot of times people come at this housing conversation through many different frames. They approach it through many different angles and values. And so this frame is where people begin their conversation and kind of that foundation. And so we can have our frames backfire. And if I talk to somebody from that has a very different background that I do and different lived experiences and different set of values, if I try to talk to them like I'm talking to a clone of myself, we're probably not going to get along, even if we actually do agree on some pretty similar things at a core level, because we're just coming from such different places. And so when we say things that make sense to us, it can backfire. We'll share a piece of data, and somebody will say, well, that doesn't meet what my expectations and meet my experiences of what I know, and so that data can't be right, even though that that data is right. And so it's a very common circumstance that we find ourselves in. And so we have to think about reframing and trying to start from a new position and build our ability to talk about housing in a much more comprehensive and productive way. And so things that we have found in our work, and there's a lot of actual psychological and linguistic research that I'm happy to share resources on, demonstrates that talking about regional fairness, so again, housing markets are regional, getting people to think about things beyond their own neighborhood and why prices are going up across the whole region, and talking about benefits for all of us when we have a housing market that works is really critical. Number two, focusing on systems and not individual decision making, because the systems are what control how we got here in the first place. Proactively explaining how we got to the situation we're in today. And then again, like I mentioned up front, pivoting to solutions. Don't talk about problems forever. Talk about what you're actually going to do about it. And so my quick little summary before I share a little bit about the regional study. Be very specific when you're talking about affordable housing, because again, there's 3 or more different definitions, and you don't know what the person you're talking to thinks about when you say affordable housing. So just be more specific. Manage expectations as a local government. You can't do a lot of things, but you do have a lot of unique powers that our state and federal governments don't have. And then, as you'll see in a second, increase regional collaboration. This really seems to be something that is gaining a lot of traction in Virginia, and is something that I think you should avail yourselves of. So, this regional study that's going on that you've probably heard a little bit about, some context for what's going on across the Commonwealth. At the state level, lawmakers have been talking about housing some more. There have been some bills through the General Assembly over the past few years. A lot of that has been focused on changes to landlord-tenant law, evictions, et cetera. There have been some attempts by some more, brave lawmakers to mandate certain zoning regimens or land use controls onto all localities in the Commonwealth. Those have not worked, as you might expect. But the governor has espoused, and our state agencies have committed to connecting housing to economic development. That is the big theme in state housing policy and state housing discussions today, and it's absolutely spot on. Because if we are going to attract jobs and new employers to all of our communities in Virginia, we need homes for those workers to live in. And so we are seeing more and more employers who want to move to Virginia because everything else is right, because we're a great state. They do the math and realize, well, we could bring in 100 workers, but based on what we're seeing, you don't have homes for them And so our lack of housing supply is becoming a governor, a restrictor plate really, to our economic development potential. At the local level, a lot of the stuff that I already talked about, but there really is an expanding appetite across local governments to figure out something to do. They want to do something, they want to make progress because they're hearing it from their economic development officials, their constituents, and voters that housing really isn't working the way that it ought to. And so there's this growing regional cooperation through the planning district commissions across the Commonwealth. And so there have been lots of regional housing studies. I think this is all of them from the past 4 or 5 years. And so there is one going on here in the Central Shenandoah region. And so some of this has mainly been spurred by our State Housing Finance Agency, Virginia Housing, committing money to this initiative and giving over $40 million to the PDCs across the state to undertake housing development activities. And so Central Shenandoah PDC received several $1 million, and this was right off their website. From yesterday, I think, an update of what they've been able to use that money for the affordable home ownership and rental projects that they have deployed that money to throughout the region. So PDCs are getting more invested and active in housing, and a lot of this is through these regional housing studies. So who's involved in this study? It's us as Housing Forward, working together with the Virginia Center for Housing Research at Virginia Tech and staff at the PDC. We've already completed listening sessions with local government staff and other officials. We've done focus groups, interviews with other players, folks that work in the housing market. Virginia Tech has completed their market assessments at the local and regional levels. And today we're currently working on drafting and trying to find different policy solutions at the local and regional level that we can collaborate on with staff to develop in unison to have as a good blueprint moving forward as a way for them to solve their housing challenges. And so we started back in 2022. We're going to finish this summer. It's been a long process, but we are past the halfway point, and we're looking forward to creating the final version, which will be a long, full report that I hope none of you ever have to open or read, because we're going to create a consumer version which will be much more pretty and much more accessible to everybody. And so, yeah, we're doing this because we need to figure out what's going on and what should the region do about it. So how are we creating these solutions and where are we today? We take everything that we've done so far and we come up with some initial ideas, 3 or 4 at most things that we can go into detail on and come out with some really specific next steps and recommendations for. And so we're getting feedback and input right now from local government staff and other stakeholders to just tell us, hey, does this sound right? Is this close to what we talked about before? Does this seem to be something that is possible and that there's some support for? Making sure it's not something that is just totally off the wall and never possible. And so we'll create a first draft of those solutions, go through another feedback process, feedback loop, and then have the full draft of the study. And then eventually a final study. And there is a regional leadership team that is helping CSPDC staff undertake this effort. And so some of the ideas that we have so far, again, this is really just spaghetti on the wall at this point is the best way to describe it. Regional solutions, ways the region can collaborate, connecting homeowners with home improvement programs that have federal and state money attached to them. A lot of those are spread out and confusing to find, so centralizing them in a hub would be really useful. Expanding housing counseling, bringing the statewide community land trust, Virginia statewide community land trust, to the region to create permanently affordable home ownership options, creating a regional land bank to acquire, hold, and repurpose tax delinquent and other underused properties for housing and community development, and then really trying to find an opportunity to create a strategic plan to end homelessness with permanent solutions to end homelessness, not more shelters, but permanent housing options for people to get out of homelessness and stay out of homelessness. And then some of the ideas that we've talked about with staff so far that we're going to be drafting out and getting feedback on are, trying to use your powers of, land use and zoning and permitting to create incentives for the types of housing that you need and that you actually want to see in the city. So aligning those efforts to your goals over the coming 5 or 10 years. Looking at ways that we can, everything on the table to try to solve, substandard conditions in rental homes throughout the city that may or may not end up, being some sort of, plan to explore in a rental inspection district. But there's lots of other things that could be pursued as well. And then there's the upcoming comprehensive plan, and so we would expect to try to position that comp plan update to be very successful in terms of the types of housing questions it asks and how its land use goals can align with the housing needs of the city. So that is probably way more than you ever needed to hear about housing. I told you to get the shepherd's hook and just pull me off. I'm sorry. But I'm going to turn it over to Leslie now to talk about the study in more detail.
And could you please provide us with a copy of your presentation?
Yep, I sent
Thank
the
you.
PDF, and I can make sure that's circulated.
Okay, thank you.
Yep,
Can I ask you one question real quick?
sure.
Yeah, that New River Trust Fund, how many municipalities are involved in that?
That is
How long has it
every-
been established, and what have they got accomplished so far?
Sure. So they used that the PDC grant from Virginia Housing to seed that trust fund. The creating a regional housing trust fund was the flagship regional recommendation from the New River Valley Regional Housing Study that we helped complete with Virginia Tech in 2022. And so they took the PDC grant and spent a lot of time, educating the different member localities about this. And all of the localities in the PDC are members of this regional trust fund now. So that includes Montgomery County and both Blacksburg and Christiansburg, Giles County, Pulaski County, Floyd County, and the city of Radford. And so they are using that Virginia housing money to kick it off. They accepted their first applications this summer and made their first awards this September to 2 projects in Blacksburg. And so the next question is going to be, how can they sustain that fund? And so that is the next big thing to figure out.
How much was the grant that they got initially?
I think 2.1, either 2.1 or 1.2 million.
And how much of that did they use to set up the program versus actually help the folks with the affordable housing?
Not all that much. I think they might have also used a separate capacity building grant from the state to fund the startup effort to figure out what they're actually going to do, have all those meetings, bring in the advisors and set things up so it can be successful. But administrative costs for housing trust funds are generally, very few percent, certainly less than 10%, if you keep it simple.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of City Council. Thank you for the opportunity to present on the Stanton Augusta Waynesboro housing data from the CSPDC's Regional Housing Study. While I hope to effectively communicate this data, I thank Jonathan for presenting on those members that have been actively involved in gathering all of the data and analyzing it. So obviously tonight I'm going to be focusing on the Stanton Augusta Waynesboro region, and as the title of the presentation speaks to, this presentation is going to be very data heavy. With that being said, I'd be remiss not to mention that the numbers and percentages that I'll be talking about in this presentation equate to citizens in Waynesboro and throughout our region that have real difficulties accessing affordable housing. So today's presentation is not going to be getting into personal stories, but I wanted to highlight this quote to remind us of the data and personal story connection that I hope we can remember as we work through this presentation. So you may have heard, the world is made up of atoms and molecules, but it's really made up of stories. When you sit with an individual that's been here, you can give quantitative data a qualitative overlay. So my work and our work in local government, and as we utilize data to create policy, we do have the real ability to affect powerful change, not only in our communities, but directly in our citizens' lives. So it's what I find most fulfilling about my career as a public servant, and so I hope that we can keep this in the forefront of our minds as we look at somewhat sterile bar charts and graphs, and remember that all of those numbers also have personal stories. So when I refer in this presentation to the MSA or Stanton MSA, please know I'm speaking about the Stanton Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is made up of Stanton, Augusta, and Waynesboro, although it's called the Stanton MSA. I'm going to focus on Waynesboro, of course, but we'll also highlight Stanton and Augusta County throughout the presentation for comparison purposes and to kind of discuss the regional housing market. So what constitutes a regional housing market? Really, it's about commuting patterns. So where do people choose to live in relation to their work, and where do people choose to work in relation to where they live? The MSAs are great measures for housing markets because housing tends to concentrate around defined jobs and amenities areas. So 63% of those who work within the Stanton MSA also live within one of the three jurisdictions. Roughly 25% of Stanton workers live in Stanton, and about 20% of Waynesboro workers live in Waynesboro. So the majority of Waynesboro workers commute into Waynesboro for work but live somewhere else, so a lot of them in the surrounding MSA or outside of the MSA, such as Harrisonburg or Charlottesville. There are roughly 50,400 households in the region, 59% in the county, 22% in Stanton, and 19% in Waynesboro. Since 2016, the Stanton-Augusta-Waynesboro region has experienced a 5.4% growth in our number of households. So for comparison, the Rockbridge region has seen no growth since 2016, and the Bath Highland region has seen a decline in households. So the growth in our region is indicative of households that are continuing to locate here, and they like to locate in proximity to the growing job opportunities and amenities that we see in the Stanton and Harrisonburg MSAs. So of those households, what percentage are made up of owners versus renters, and how does that compare across the region? 70% of households in the MSA are owners, and that's primarily driven by a higher rate of home ownership in Augusta County, which is 78.5%. Renters are more concentrated in Stanton and Waynesboro. Stanton has a home ownership rate of 59% and Waynesboro 60%. It's important to note that in Waynesboro, lower rates of home ownership are primarily driven by higher rates of rentership among younger households. So 62% of renter-occupied households are headed by individuals that are 34 years or younger. So what is the makeup of individuals living in the region's households? What do the living arrangements look like? Most households in the Stanton, Augusta, Waynesboro region are one or two person households, with 29% being one person and 36% being two person households. These numbers are really true throughout the region, but one and two person households do make up a larger percentage of the population in Stanton and Waynesboro than in the county. 64% of households in the MSA are family households, so meaning they're related in some way. So you can think of married couples, nuclear families, married couples with children, single parents with children, or even grandparents raising their grandchildren. There's approximately 3,000 households in the MSA, so around 6%, that are non-family member roommates, and that tends to be a little more common in Stanton and Augusta than it is, Stanton and Waynesboro than it is in Augusta County. Of the more than 15,000 people that are living alone, just under half are 65 or older, and among people 35 and older who live alone, 61%, so a majority of those own their home, and most who are younger than 35, roughly 75%, rent their home. So I will point out that this slide is an older, so it's a 2009 HUD income limits, and as Jonathan showed on an earlier slide, in 2023, those numbers are roughly 10,000 higher than they are, but I decided to leave this in because it was part of the housing study that's been ongoing for 2 years, and those percentages that have, and the data that's been analyzed were based off of these numbers, but just to point out that now we're roughly 10,000 higher for those low income limits. So as you'll see, more than half of Waynesboro households have low incomes. And that's roughly 4,855 households. 45% in Stanton, and that's compared to 38% in Augusta County. So approximately half of all low-income households throughout the region are cost burdened. And just to remind you what Jonathan mentioned, you're considered cost burdened if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, and severely cost burdened if you're spending more than 50% of your income on housing costs. And then you'll see there that 85% are cost burdened and make up 85% of the cost burdened households in the area. So this chart shows that of cost-burdened households and low-income cost-burdened households, how they compare across the area. So Waynesboro is the lowest at 30.6% cost-burdened households as a percentage of the total population. Stanton is 27.9%, and Augusta County at 21.7%. And then kind of the second row there, the low income, so 80% of area median income. The cost-burdened households as a percentage of all cost-burdened households. And you can see that Waynesboro similarly is the highest at 90.2%, Augusta County at 81.5%, and Stanton at 87.5%. So I'd like to talk about working households, as we talk about housing insecurity, and we also talk about that spectrum that Jonathan mentioned. What are the percentages of these households where there's workers and how many earners are involved? So 70% of households in the region include at least one worker. Most households that do not include workers are likely to be retired, 29%, or disabled, 4%. Among working households in the region, 50% include one worker and 40% include two earners, with 10% including three or more workers. Waynesboro and Augusta County are very similar, with 71% and 72% respectively for the percentage of working households, and Stanton's a little bit lower at 66%, which is likely attributable to the age of the population. So with the majority of households being working households, what are the occupation types that are most prevalent in our area, and how do their wages measure up to the cost of housing? The Virginia Tech Center for Housing Research compared maximum affordable housing costs by occupation to housing costs for households in 3 different scenarios covering the top 10 occupations within our region. So the first is a single earner earning at the median for his or her occupation, and that's represented by the orange bars. The second scenario are dual earners, so a household with 2 earners earning at an occupation's median wage, and that's represented by the yellow bars in the chart. And then the last comparative scenario is a single earner earning at the 90th percentile of his or her occupation, and that's represented by the gray bars. So these comparisons were chosen because they're representative of typical households in the region. As I previously discussed, households generally include 1 or 2 workers, with only 10% being 3 or more. Single earners were included as a comparative, or single earners earning at the 90th percentile were included as part of the comparative analysis to kind of identify if one could more readily afford housing costs later in their career as their salaries often increase. The solid horizontal lines on the chart represent median owner costs with a mortgage, and the dashed horizontal lines represent the median gross rent. Since it's a little small, red is for Stanton, green is for Augusta County, and the navy blue is for Waynesboro. So as evidenced by this graph, a single earner earning at the 90th percentile working as a fast food or counter worker, cashier, or personal care aide likely cannot afford rent at the area median costs. And then some other occupations, stockers and order fillers, retail persons, as well as office clerks earning at the 90th percentile are very close to not being able to afford the median rent costs. In terms of home ownership, registered nurses and general operations managers that are single earners would be able to access affordable home ownership opportunities, but all other occupations would need to share home ownership housing costs, so would have to be double earners in order to not be cost burdened in the Stanton MSA. Fast food workers, cashiers, and personal care aides are likely unable to access affordable homeownership opportunities, even if they're doubled up with another household earner making a similar salary. So available housing that is affordable for service and support workers within our region will really help businesses retain and attract workers. Housing is needed to accommodate personal care aides as we have a growing senior population and increased demand for in-home health services. So with this chart and all of the different categories I'm discussing, many of these workers would qualify for subsidized housing, as Jonathan spoke about the low-income housing tax credit developments and housing choice vouchers if units are available. So I do know that with the Waynesboro Redevelopment Housing Authority, they have a certain number of vouchers. A lot of those aren't being utilized specifically because there are not units where they can utilize them. So developing new subsidized housing with a priority for local workers would really allow the Stanton MSA to more easily retain its current workforce and attract new workers. So a little bit about the housing stock. The majority of housing in the region is single-family detached at 75.4%. Multifamily makes up about 13%. Mobile and manufactured homes make up 6%. And it's important to note that 10% of Augusta County housing stock is manufactured or mobile homes. And single-family attached makes up 5%. Duplexes, townhomes, and multifamily units are a bit more common in Stanton at 28% and Waynesboro at 32% than in the county. So how does existing housing stock and the number of bedrooms align with family size and living arrangements? And that gets back to Jonathan's example of kind of people getting into a different stage of their life where they might be living in a larger home with a lot of bedrooms and it might not necessarily be needed. So although 29% of households within the MSA are individuals living alone, our efficiency and one-bedroom units represent only 8% of our housing stock. Two-bedroom units make up 22%, three-bedroom units 49%, and four or more bedroom units 21%. So does this have an effect on housing costs? So for example, a three-person family could really share a two-bedroom space without creating some kind of overcrowded situation. And while 81% of our households are three or fewer people, only 30% of units are two or fewer bedrooms. So it kind of looks at, is there a need or could we see a decrease in housing costs and cost-burdened households by repurposing existing housing stock to better align with our current living arrangements? And I won't go into read all of these off, but this chart just represents the region's housing stock in terms of age. And so 29%, so being built between 1980 and 1999. And then you have roughly 23% between 1960 and 1979. And 20% after the year 2000. Just to point out some of the specifics, Augusta County has the newest housing stock. Just under a quarter of their housing has been built in 2000 or later, the year 2000 or later, and that could be attributable, they have a lot more land and available developable land than the cities have. Stanton has one of the oldest housing stocks within the CSPDC region, with 43% built prior to 1960 and then 20% built prior to 1940. And then specifically for Waynesboro, a third of Waynesboro's housing stock was built prior to 1960. So I point these ages out to note that homes do need regular maintenance and periodic upgrades. Service providers and then also input we've received through community outreach, specifically with CDBG entitlement. Individuals have noted increased requests for critical home repair in the region. So when you're experiencing a state of cost burden in relation to your housing costs, those really important upgrades and maintenance are often deferred for other living expenses. So nearly 1,350 owners in Waynesboro are cost burdened, 920 of who have low incomes and may benefit from programs such as tax abatement for seniors, critical home repair, USDA home renovation loans, or weatherization assistance programs. And that gets back to that stabilization S that Jonathan was speaking about. So I'd like to veer slightly off course for just a moment to recognize, again, back to Jonathan's complexity in the term housing affordability and the many subsets of individuals that experiencing housing insecurity. So think back to that spectrum. So with vulnerable populations, likely very different than what we were previously talking about, working household scenarios. Vulnerable populations cover those who experience chronic housing insecurity, mental health conditions, and substance use disorders. Vulnerable populations tend to be on the left end of that spectrum, extremely low income, and often experience rental discrimination. Service providers did note throughout the study that a substantial need for additional supportive housing units paired with wraparound services to really address those underlying issues of chronic housing insecurity. A 2023 report by the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Development Services indicated that the Valley Community Service Board area needs to add an additional 125 units to its existing 120 units for permanent supportive housing, just to meet current demand. So again, kind of in that catch-up state, which is hard when we're working towards healing the past and also planning for the future. So as you can see, the need for increased permanent supportive housing is really a different subset within the larger problem of affordable housing. And again, pointing out the complexity is important as we all talk about framing and then the policies that fix or work towards fixing all the different subsets. Housing vacancy within the Stanton MSA has reduced by more than 20% since 2016. So further evidence for increased demand in our region. The reduction is mostly from market vacancies, units vacant for rent or vacant for sale, and units being held for seasonal or recreational use. Those long-term vacancies, so buildings slated for demolition or that have been held for a long time without being occupied, they've remained constant at around 3% of the total housing stock, and that's roughly 1,800 units. Long-term vacancies may be a great opportunity to increase available housing stock if you can encourage owners to rent or sell those units, although sometimes it's difficult for localities to find ways to affect that change. So our region is experiencing an extremely tight market with low market vacancy rates. And in order to increase elasticity in the market, the region might consider prioritizing higher density development, especially on remaining developable land where appropriate, as a means to stabilize that market demand. According to CoStar data, the vacancy rates for the region are 1.1% for Stanton, Waynesboro, the vacancy rate, 1.1 for Stanton, 1.8 for Waynesboro, 1.9 for Stuarts Draft, and 2.5 for Fishersville. A typical healthy market vacancy rate would be between 2 and 7, so we're certainly on the tighter end. The low market vacancy rates indicate that there's not enough inventory on the market to satisfy the current demand. Also, the tight home ownership market and that tightening rental market likely affect investments, as Jonathan previously mentioned. So the more elastic the market, the more incentive landlords and homeowners have to invest in their properties, to attract renters, or to realize return on investments when they sell. The tight rental market also may encourage buyers to make really minimal investments and then flip previously owner-occupied units for rental purposes. High demand for rental units with a limited supply can discourage long-term investments, since tenants are really the ones competing for the properties, accepting less quality for higher rent rather than landlords competing for the tenants. And as Jonathan mentioned, low and moderate income renters are often the ones affected the most in this competitive process. So again, another S with supply. One way to encourage that investment is back to increasing the supply. Median gross rent, so the median rent in the Stanton MSA is $911. Augusta County does have higher rents than Stanton and Waynesboro. When adjusted for inflation, median rent in Stanton and Waynesboro has shown a decrease from 2019 to 2021, which is a little counterintuitive, but please keep in mind that pandemic-related rental increase moratoriums really had an effect on these numbers. In Stanton and Waynesboro, the addition of rental units should really focus on those market gaps, so units for extremely low-income households and units for moderate and higher income households. Most rented units, 59% in the Stanton MSA, cost less than $1,000 per month to rent, while 41% cost $1,000 or more. So despite the existence of the low-cost units, renters throughout the region are disproportionately cost-burdened. They make up 29% of all households, but 49% of the cost-burdened households. So again, there's not enough supply to serve renters with extremely low incomes, and 60% of those rental units are occupied by households with higher incomes. So when there's not enough units to serve the moderate and higher income households, then moderate and higher income households end up competing with the low income households for affordable units. This slide shows home ownership market conditions. All three localities have experienced, I'll go to this one. All localities have experienced increasing sales prices since 2014. Stanton's median home price has seen the most dramatic increase by 85% since 2014. Waynesboro's home price has increased by 79%, and Augusta County's by 70%. So these increased prices and the 2023 high interest rates really made home ownership less accessible, certainly for first-time home buyers. So speaking to this tight home ownership market, first-time home buyers are having a difficult time accessing the market with inventory that's currently available. And then that lack of overall inventory prevents homeowners from moving up and freeing inventory for those first-time home buyers, and it kind of creates that gridlock situation. So one important indicator of market tightness is days on the market. So Stanton, Augusta, and Waynesboro all averaged just 6 days on the market in 2022, suggesting that the price increases are closely related to a lack of supply. So a healthy number of days on the market is between 30 and 60 days, and really that range provides kind of breathing room for those that are looking to sell their homes. With 30 to 60 days, you know you have enough time to put your home on the market and also go out and look for another home, and that transition is much more manageable and kind of eliminates that gridlock situation that's created when the days on the market are so low. So the MSA is in a catch-up market and will need to significantly add to the housing inventory to rebalance that supply and demand. So those are the specific data. As Jonathan was speaking, I was looking through this slide and realizing that all of these do correspond with one of those S's, and so I think it's really helpful to think about it in that way. So the biggest takeaway from the data is supply, that we can increase supply and need to increase supply for sale and for rental units. Secondly, meeting demand for modest units that are affordable to low and moderate incomes is critical to retain the quality retail and service amenities. So without this segment of the housing market, our region will trend more towards a bedroom community if those that are service workers cannot afford to live in the community where they work. The addition of units to rebalance that supply and demand will encourage property investment. Housing conditions are likely addressed through the addition of competition in the market of affordable rental units, so those new subsidized units through low-income housing tax credits primarily. As Jonathan mentioned, we can include housing goals in our planning documents and have those goals spur then changes in the zoning and subdivision ordinance to potentially increase density and reduce costs. Low-income housing tax credits and development incentives, so kind of reaching out and building partnerships with developers and doing anything we can on the local end to make those applications more competitive when they compete for state low-income housing tax credits. And then lastly, with the stability piece, the critical home repair and aging in place as a means for us to really provide stabilization for existing households of low to moderate incomes. So that's all I have, unless you all have any questions.
Any questions? Really?
Well, I got a
I figured you
little
did.
bit of oxygen,
That's why I looked right at you. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, have at it.
Well, Leslie, you said that We have the vouchers, but we don't have the units. Is that because existing units don't accept the vouchers?
I'm not exactly sure. I assume it's a combination of finding complexes that will accept them and then also not having enough units where the vouchers can be used.
Okay. And so our vacancy rate for Waynesboro is 1.8%. I recall at a planning commission, it was a by right development. And in that briefing that we received, they kind of alluded to the question was asked whether or not those units would offer any kind of incentives for low income. And they alluded to the fact that by them going with the market rate, that would free up the lower end rentals. Is based on what you just briefed, is there any validity to that? That if we have a development that comes in and they're going to rent at the market rate, that the other units now will become available?
I don't know if it's necessarily as succinct as that automatically there would be people that would move from one to the other. So I don't think it's as easy as that, but I do think that any increase in the supply, market or otherwise, would help kind of rebalance some of these issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is the filtering question, right? What are the dynamics when new units are created at market rate? Do those units attract people that wouldn't have otherwise moved to Waynesboro in this case? Or are they capturing folks that were coming to Waynesboro anyway, or lived in Waynesboro already, and would be competing against it because they are, they have the ability to live in a market rate unit, certainly have the ability to, be a much more attractive renter than a lower income tenant for an existing rental property in the city. And so there's a lot of kind of theory and assumptions that go in behind that. It really hasn't been until the last 5 years or so that researchers have tried to investigate this question to see what happens to the housing supply chain in a way when new units are added, particularly market rate units, because there is, I think, legitimate concern that adding new market rate units in perhaps a lower income community can, contribute to displacement, et cetera. And there's, the results from research so far that academics have done is, not 100% clear cut, but by and large, the takeaways seem to be that this kind of resorting and filtering does work. It's complex because housing markets are regional, and we have to follow those commuting patterns, so it's never always like a one-for-one thing that you can clearly count on. But at scale, adding new supply, even if it is market rate, and assuming there is a strong demand for it, will create lower pressure on the lower priced units and keep those available to folks who can afford less and certainly can't probably afford a new market rate unit.
Thank you.
Good.
One more. Mr. Short, I don't know if you remember, you mentioned something about maybe looking at our certificate of occupancy. Is there can you kind of expound on that?
Yeah, that was an idea that exists in a few states, not in Virginia. It would require a Code of Virginia change that there are some municipalities in the Midwest and out in the Northwest that have a certificate of occupancy standard where when a multifamily unit, in some cases even single-family dwelling units, are required to have their certificate of occupancy recertified by the locality prior to a transactional purchase, right? So What that would mean is that an inspector would have to visit the site. You'd have to have a pretty big inspection program, but would go in, perform an inspection on the unit or the home, identify any deficiencies in terms of safety or operations, create citations that would require that those issues get addressed prior to the recertification, which then would impede the ability for the owner of that property to transact the property until the repairs were made. But I did investigate that through the Virginia Municipal League and had it as a topic of conversation this past spring. And, you know, we put a person on, you know, put a man on the moon. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would require, you know, a very concerted effort and a lot of mobilization, and it would take a considerable amount of time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just building on one of Kenny's points, respect to the you know, we add 100 units to say of market rate, and how that market rate could then fundamentally offer additional capacity to lower income housing options, right? So that argument. Now I'm gonna do some twisted math here, y'all. All right, but just because I'm Swiss cheesing a few different and connecting the different presentations and sort of things that were verbalized. So 56,000 households in the MSA, right thereabout. Of that, in the Valley, an 11% deficit in units. So if I were to just extrapolate that just to our small little MSA, which is much larger, much smaller than the Valley, even at that level, that's like a 6,000 unit deficit. So 100 units in Waynesboro, you're not even moving the needle. Not even moving the needle. So you would have, it would have to be a substantial. And so I mean, I had a couple of questions, and you know, I'm a big fan of music, and so I remember like the 8-track tapes, but even the gaps in between songs, you know, that each song sort of tells a story. And so I thought that was really interesting to hear all the different perspectives and information, lots of wealth of information, and but in between each of these stories are other perspectives and other stories that could influence it as well. I mean, Virginia is unique, and there has been a moratorium on annexation since 1986, right? So we have a multi-million-dollar roadway, a la Ludowet, that was constructed in the 80s that we're just now realizing some pretty substantial appreciable increase in value and development interest. But then the supporting housing infrastructure to support that, we're jammed up right against the county. So, right? So we're the ones that have the water sewer capacity that we could easily cross over, you know, behind Zeus and start tapping into things. But the Commonwealth has made the decision that cities can't do that. So what that does is that then it puts the resources, and I'm not saying that that's the best place for, you know, targeted housing, but it also makes it the reality that it's very complicated to address this issue or identify what the first few incremental steps are, because you're left with what you have. You know, our land inventory is it. Mm-hmm. It is. You know, it's been the same since 1986. So, in the absence of that, you have to then look at all your other, all the other competing interests for those properties. So, you know, I think one of the questions I had was, you know, does the Commonwealth of Virginia permit localities the ability to conditionally award grants to provide fixed permanent rental rates? And of course, if they were the recipient of a DCHD grant or a HUD grant, there may be those conditions. But in terms of the authority of a locality to go and say, we're going to grant you this zoning provision, our hands are tied with what, if it comes in and it's a multifamily, there's nothing that could prescribe, that I'm aware of, that's permitted in the Code of Virginia, that would permit the locality to invoke very specific and stringent market conditions on the affordability of those units. So, so that's one, skip on the 4-track. I think the other one would be just the argument of capitalism, right? And sort of I've heard lots, and I don't discount all of it either with respect to, I've heard from folks in the community that additional burdens of inspections and conditions placed on marginal housing in the city could thereby increase the rental rates, but then only push more folks out. But I mean, I think your point was excellent, that really the truth is that they've got 10 other people waiting behind them. And then you have conditions where you've seen a 79% increase in our overall housing valuation over a short few period of years, and that valuation makes it less attractive to, well, if I had just a dump truck of cash outside, I'd probably buy every single family dwelling around the city, and I think a lot of people do, and they park on it and they rent it because they know that, heck, if I can do this, have that renter pay my mortgage and then some, and future conditions can't be predicted off of past performance, but if it's half right, I can get a 35% return or 40% return on my investment in a period of fractional years. Yeah, sign me up for that. So that's probably the other skip on the 4-track. And so I think there's that element of greed that I think we have to acknowledge. And then also I found it interesting, and there wasn't a story to be told on the graphic that showed the beginning of HUD-based grants and the like, but started around the early 80s. So prior to the early 80s, what was the participation of government? It was much more robust. It was centralized in the federal level. And so instead what's happened is everything gets pushed down, it trickles down into local communities like ours with, that's financially fragile, a community like ours that's financially fragile, to go figure this out. Just give them more subsidies. Well, yeah, great. So we provide more subsidies to provide that as a community. Well, there's going to be a cost associated with that as well that will have to be paid by something, whether it's services for government services, educating kids, all these costs. I mean, it compounds. If I have figured out anything after my tenure on council here, it's this: everything is connected. Every daggone thing is connected. And if you think that it's not, let's go grab coffee. Because I can tell you, every freaking thing is connected. And so, I think to our comprehensive plan, and Leslie and I had this conversation, Mike had a conversation a few weeks back, I look at back of the plan. And was it perfect? No. But, I thought it was a great step. But I'll tell anybody, the thing that I have found the most frustrating about not being able to convert, and I think with my colleagues and past councils, we've been really converting a lot of great stuff out of that comp plan. But housing is incredibly complicated because those competing interests, those personal priorities, how you can personally, financially gain, your preferences, government coming in and saying, that's not the right condition of housing. Well, who are we to say what the right condition of housing? I mean, obviously, be safe, but it's those dynamics are very, very complicated, and so there's the last skip, and my last skip on the four track would be, which I've said to Mike, and we've had this conversation. I think even when Jim was here, of, you know, how do you solve a hard problem? Is you try to make it as small as possible. And I would love and would wholeheartedly support a city strategy where we were very specific about a targeted neighborhood, a targeted area, a couple of blocks. Let's figure out what works for the scale and scope of Waynesboro, of what we can accomplish in a couple of blocks. Because what happens is that what I'm afraid will happen at the end of this, with all the wonderful research that's gone on to the housing study and great information we're going to have, I think a lot of folks are going to be overwhelmed by it and not know what the next steps are going to be. And so for our community and for the benefit of our citizens and the citizens yet to come, is I think we need to be strategic about testing out what are the right solutions for Waynesboro that we can afford, that we can target, and we can kind of realize. Because if we try to, the big ideas are wonderful, and I think that should be addressed regionally. I mean, if we can figure out a way as a region, well, five localities to figure out how to incarcerate people, I think we can figure out how to provide some affordable housing. We ought to. And so I think that for the larger program, that's really should be a focus. But we got to be really targeted and very specific about Waynesboro and figure out micro solutions to it, because, you know, again, I'm not saying it's 6,000 units that, you know, we all our alone have to sort of accommodate, but if it's just half that, that's 1,000 per the MSA, and we don't even move the needle with 100-unit development. So,
Thank
and
you.
there's the 4-track is over. See how that worked out?
Thank you.
I was making up the 4 tracks as I riffed, by the way. So,
Jim, anything?
My questions earlier.
Okay, thank you, everybody, for your comments, questions, and your presentations. And with that, we're ready to leave unless Mike has anything else to add. Okay,
ma'am.
thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you.